it's Pastor Dan from Dexter Gospel Church with the Proverbs Practical. Appreciate you watching. This proverb tells us how we can move forward successfully after doing something wrong. We're in Proverbs 28, verse 13. It says, "He that covers his sins shall not prosper, but whoso confesses and forsakes them shall have mercy." So here's a key to living a righteous life. It was the primary difference between Solomon's father David and the king who preceded him, Saul. Saul, when he was confronted about his sins, things he'd done wrong, couldn't confess and forsake, but David, when he was confronted, did. The idea of covering, he that covers his sins, is that of denying or disowning. It can be making excuses and blaming other people for it, so that you claim not to have actually done anything wrong. Yes, I did that, but it was their fault, or it wasn't really wrong for me to do that. It can be simply lying about what was done, saying you didn't do things that you actually did, or did do things that you actually didn't. In any case, when confronted, it's refusing to take responsibility and admit that you did something wrong. If we can't take responsibility for what we've done and acknowledge when we did wrong, we cannot be successful, we cannot prosper. Of course, in their system, under the Old Testament law, that meant you couldn't offer a sacrifice and make atonement. If you hadn't sinned, you couldn't have atonement. In ours, even as believers, when we sin, we hurt our relationship with God. We can't lose our salvation, since that isn't based on our works anyway, but we can damage our relationship, our walk with God. We can't have that prosperous spiritual life. We can't have the restored standing of forgiveness unless we're willing to confess. I think, too, that this verse, because Proverbs isn't just a spiritual book, but a very practical one, applies not only to spiritual matters and getting right with God, but also to human relationships. It can apply in court. How does it go for a defendant when they enter an innocent plea, then it is proven that they're lying on the stand to cover up their sin, their crime? It can apply in a marriage. It can apply on a job. We all wrong people sometimes. We all do wrong that affect our relationships sometimes. And as long as we refuse to admit it when we've done something wrong, we cannot have the best possible relationship with the people on the other side of that action. We cannot have their favor or their mercy. That relationship cannot prosper. When we won't acknowledge our sins, but instead try to cover them up, we cannot prosper spiritually, relationally, or personally. Fortunately, there's another half to this verse. The person who would have mercy, the person who, in our covenant with God, would have a healthy relationship with Him, must confess. This means to acknowledge, or even to point out. It's the opposite of denying and covering up. The New Testament idea of confession will extend to saying the same thing, that is, agreeing with God about what we've done and that it is wrong. And again, I think this applies not only in our relationship with God, but also in our other relationships. But it's not enough here in Proverbs just to admit that something wrong was done. It's whoso confesses and forsakes. That is, you can't stay in there. You can't keep doing the same thing. You can't stay in the same place. There must be an intent and perhaps even action to turn away from that sin. Whether it's human justice that recognizes that a first offender isn't the same as a repeat offender, a human spouse who's been hurt time and again by words or actions, or God's Spirit that knows whether we genuinely intend to turn from this behavior or whether we're already planning on coming right back to it, there must be action away from what is wrong. And when those components are present, whether it's in human court, earthly relationships, a spiritual walk with God, that is where we find mercy. This is where our relationships are restored and trust is regained. This is where our standing with God is improved. This is where even judges will have mercy. Please note that this is a crucial element to good relationships. When you're in conflict with someone and there's legitimately something you have done wrong or could have done better, here is a recipe for improving rather than harming that relationship. First, don't blame, shift, and scapegoat. Lie and cover up. Acknowledge what you did. Take responsibility for it. Now, you don't have to take responsibility for what anyone else does. You can't. But you do have to take responsibility for what you do. I remember as a teenager having some conflict with one of my parents, and an old youth pastor told me when I asserted that 95% of the problems were that parent's fault, he said that I needed to take care of the 5% that were my fault. Then secondly, express an intent not to do it again. Maybe even show how you intend to forsake that thing and not do it again. People have a hard time extending mercy and favor to those they think are just going to turn around and do the same thing over again. They assume that there isn't any real remorse, no sincere confession, if we don't also demonstrate an intent not to repeat the action. This can mean taking deliberate action. If we don't want to drink again, we might avoid alcohol. If we don't want to give in to anger again, we might explore where it springs from and how to change our behavior and responses. If we don't want to be critical, we might turn toward being deliberately more thankful. We don't just acknowledge we did something wrong and feel bad about it. We deliberately move away from it and leave it behind to go to something right. If we won't take responsibility for our actions and acknowledge what we've done wrong specifically, or if it looks like we're going right back to it again, it's really hard for people to take our apologies seriously. It's really hard for us to have healthy, prospering relationships. But if we will do that, we can find mercy and favor. Relationships can be restored and healthy. We can grow in our fellowship with God instead of being stalled out and distant. We can improve our relationships with people instead of just damaging them. We can begin to prosper in our walk with God, in our relationships with others, and in our lives. May we be a people who take responsibility, express remorse, and take deliberate action away from doing wrong again. I hope this video is a blessing to you. A little longer than our normal, but it's such a crucial concept. If it is a blessing, give it a like. If you haven't already, subscribe to our channel for more content from the Scriptures. Until next time, I hope you stay well and confess and forsake sin.